Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes to our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Our focus today is on state government, and our guest is Assemblymember Alex Lee. Alex Lee represents the 25th Assembly District in Sacramento. Hello, Alex. How are you?
Hey, pleasure to be here on the show.
Thank you for being with us today. Appreciate it very much. So I will say that in our experience as activists in Santa Clara County, you kind of blew onto the scene. You were known as a staffer in the area, and then many were really surprised when you became a candidate for assembly. And there were some folks who were surprised when you won in the primary among the Democrats. And I wanted to take you back to kind of where you came to this life of public service before that, because you have been serving as a staffer, and I know that that's a commitment to public service. What do you think of? Could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, how you were connected to your community, what made you choose this kind of life in government and public service?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I mean, certainly of the many people we surprised, I surprised myself in pulling off the feat of winning our state assembly seat when I was just 24 years old. I'm 25 years old now, but at that time I was 24. We certainly were surprised because we were outspent very heavily, 15-1. We were out endorsed, and every conventional metric we were predicted to lose. But we ran a very strong grassroots campaign from the start, where we took no corporate money, where we met people where they were. We knocked on doors, went to every small event you could go to. Prior to COVID, COVID was a different story, but we did all of that and it pulled off. And we, even since election day itself on March 3rd, 2020, we had held the lead, and that was quite a wild ride for us to wait till the results are certified, because even I was quite amazed. But my background has always kind of been in public service. I think about how just 4 to 5 years ago, when President Donald Trump was elected to office, I was already halfway through my term as UC Davis's student body president. And I remember how much anxiety that caused my campus community and what we had to do to navigate that through. And in a lot of ways, I'm still doing a very similar job. I mean, I only represented 30,000 students back then, but now I represent almost 500,000 people in the state legislature. So the scale is a little different. But right out of the gate, right out of graduating from UC Davis, even during UC Davis, I interned at the state legislature because I knew I wanted to work there where progress was actually happening. While I was growing up, Congress was not exactly known to be the most effective body of policymaking. There was a lot of partisanship, there was a lot of gridlock. And I saw in California, we could really make a lot of strides. We were making huge strides in our climate change goals and our social justice goals. And I was seeing that there's a lot of potential to do that, even though usually state houses, I think, get a bad rap or they get underrated. But I think California has a lot of potential. So right out of the gate, I interned and then worked for State Senator Henry Stern, who himself was the first millennial in the state Senate. Then I worked for Assemblymember Evan Lowe as his field representative. And it just so happened when I decided to move home and be a field representative in San Jose, the incumbent, my predecessor, Kansan Chu, decided to not seek re-election. And I guess just the way the stars aligned.
That was sort of the first surprise, really, wasn't it?
That was.
I want to ask you that question. I'd like to hear a little bit more about UC Davis. But when you heard that news, obviously, you made the decision to run, and there were other candidates who were mentioned, other candidates who stepped in, some who stepped out. There's a lot of shuffling around. But what made you feel like recognize that as an opportunity or a thing you wanted or felt you needed to do to jump in so fully into the race in the way that you did?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, literally, what was it? May 2019, Kansan Chu decided not to seek re-election. He sought a different election, of course. And then in June, I declared my candidacy. And it was a really big step for a young person back then. And frankly, I didn't have the idea until a lot of people suddenly were saying you should try, go for it, because they knew my background. And people in my community that I grew up with knew what I was doing at the state level. And they knew I had some experience with it. And they said, you should try for it. And back then, I remember saying, wow, me, 23, and I was 23 too back then. I was 23, right. And I could lose $1 bajillion. Could I do that? But luckily, I had people that kind of demystified the process with me and figured it out. And it was doable as possible, but it was, a long shot. And I thought, we definitely were living in the real depths of the Trump era, even before coronavirus swept this country. But
I remember it wore us down every day worse than the day before. So that was a dark year.
every day. But I thought, if it's not going to be me who's making this progressive push, then who? And I really asked myself that question a lot. And I said, the worst case scenario is I try and I get these ideas out there and we'll move hopefully the conversation more to the progressive side. But I felt I owed it to my community to try. And luckily my community felt the trust in me to serve for them.
So, Alex, you mentioned about being a president of your class or a student government at UC Davis.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty big school, actually. How did that come about? Were you a very social person, or were you involved in policy issues on campus that resonated with students? How do you think that came about? What was your focus?
Even since I was a child to today, I'm still an introvert. So I wouldn't describe myself as the most social person, but I had been involved in student government since I was also a senator before being president. But I just knew there was also a real need for our student government to be acting more on the behalf of our students. So kind of unique to UC Davis is we were also at that point, a $13 million nonprofit. We ran the bus line, we ran all the cafeterias, we had actual services we also managed. So so more than simply an advocacy body.
Wow.
But it was important to have all of that, I think, governed well. And that was something I recognized because of all the need that was happening. And I was also governing in the time of this tuition freeze and then tuition hike at the same time. And there's a lot of things that happened. But I knew that, again, I felt that calling that someone needed to step up who cared enough to do these things, because a lot of this stuff is really unglamorous and really terrible sometimes, but someone has to do it for everyone else. And I thought, I'm interested enough to give it a shot. And so I ran for president then, and it also worked out.
Fabulous. Alex, that experience of being in college and being so involved with student concerns and the just on-campus services, you probably have a much more personal and recent experience with the budget challenges and just the opportunity challenges with our UC and CSU systems. They're at the same time a fabulous resource of which, as Californians, we can be so proud. But also, students end up sometimes some students have a hard time getting access to those opportunities. Other students face challenges in getting their classes, graduating on time, taking on debt to pay for the high cost of schooling. What's your perspective on all of that? And what are your ideas about, what student communities need?
Yeah. Well, I'm really lucky to be appointed to the budget subcommittee on education finance and the education policy myself. So I like to joke that, I get to make these decisions about the college level decisions after graduating like 4 years ago. And sometimes it makes my colleagues feel old, but I only pointed out to say that my experience is very recent. And I'm really glad now, I think, the state level policy discussions are finally evolving where they're more and more student centric. I think before they were very abstract without the student input. And now we're talking about student basic needs when they're at college level, right? Where there's historic amounts of students who are homeless or food insecure, which is awful. And then a lot of students graduate with enormous amounts of debt. And then even if you, even applying to colleges, there are so many different problems and roadblocks. So really breaking down those barriers at every level is going to be super important to me. And being on the budget committee where we can put the resources to solve these problems is really exciting to me, because we can prioritize initiatives where we can get students fed, get students and get students set up for success, essentially. I'm going to be working on measures to hopefully expand our PIA resources. I'm working on 4 different measures that actually increase taxes on those who I think have unfairly concentrated their wealth. So hopefully we'll be able to have them pay their fair share and really reinvest in our communities, because that's going to be so important to addressing the problems that we see today.
Alex, you mentioned as you were getting ready to run, kind of connecting with your advisors and activists that you were engaged with. You mentioned feeling a connection to your community and a desire to represent your community. And that can be defined in so many different ways. What are some of the ways that matter for you? Are you, for example, what generation do you identify with, or do you consider yourself a part of?
I identify as Gen Z.
Gen Z. Okay, so
I consider myself the oldest Gen Z possible.
Yeah. We have that connection because I claim to be the first baby of Generation X, and so it's an interesting thing to be on what demographers consider to be a borderline, because of course you probably know, as a result of being on such a borderline, that exactly when those transitions happen is not a scientific thing, and people have
Yeah, it's very. I mean, it's literally the most social construct you could create, but
right.
it's
Yes.
quite arbitrary. And I feel a stronger affinity to Gen Zers than I
Mhm.
do to millennials in a lot of respect. Even though age range, perhaps more people consider me as a millennial, but
What's an example of what you consider
see that I was afraid you're gonna ask that question because
that?
because I was gonna say, like, I've tried to explain this to folks who aren't either millennial or Gen Z, and it becomes very like to a point where it's like, oh, I don't see the difference, you know. So I don't know, how can I. It's been one of those.
It's often something that
Yeah,
feels more
hard.
native, right? Native or
Yeah,
intuitive. It's like for people like me, the internet and computers are something that we learned as adults to adapt to.
yeah,
But for younger people, I know that just it's part of their native experience of life.
yeah. There's a lot of different experiences. I was thinking there's one way I always use to describe it, but I would alienate like 90% of your viewers if I said this because no one would understand.
Yes. Well, I think that it's an interesting thing to have that identification. What about within your community? I've noticed, for example, that in your official letterhead, you have Chinese language characters for your name and your office. Can you say a little bit about that and why that's important to you, and why you make that choice to do that?
Yeah, it's really important to be able to display my Chinese name. That's actually a Chinese name I had since birth. It's also my middle name. That's a fun fact. Is it's
Ah,
the My middle name is the anglicized version of my Chinese name.
are you able to
Um,
say it in a way that
yeah. So in Cantonese, my name is Lei Tianming. In Mandarin, it's Li Tianming. And then so in the anglicized version, what you see in my middle name is Tin Ming. It's like the closest way you can do it. It's like it's very like yeah, it's like the closest way you can do it to the Cantonese version. So
I
that's why
see?
I'm Alex Teely. That's my middle name.
Mhm.
So
Do
yeah,
you
that's a
speak
fun fact.
either Cantonese or Mandarin, or
I
do you
can
pronounce your name properly?
I speak fluent Chinglish, which is a combination of Chinese and English really well.
Yeah.
But I can speak fine. I mean, like I have enough Chinese skill to survive if I went somewhere, but it's like I can't really explain policy to people in Chinese. Although I've tried several times on the campaign trail, because my district is actually over 40% Asian and Pacific Islander. So
Wow.
I've had many instances where someone can't speak proficient English, and I've tried. I remember having a very detailed conversation about housing to someone in Chinese, and it was very difficult. But I tried it, and they appreciated the effort.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important thing. It's like about showing respect and inclusion, and I think that I'm sure you'd be great at that. I want to ask you about one hard thing before we take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about policy. And it seems like you really have a lot you want to say about that.
Love policy.
You mentioned the 40% of your district is Asian American, and probably 40% of our county is now Asian American. Where we've a lot of our growth and success and strength has come from a number of Asian American sources of immigration. The Vietnamese community has brought so much strength to the county, and then a lot of folks who've come in and helped us build this tech industry have come from China and India and other places. And I wanted to just get your feedback or your thoughts about this recent wave of pretty violent anti-Asian American crimes. What should we all be doing as a community, and what should we understand about that? And just what is your reaction and thought about that?
Yeah, it's a terrible tragedy right now that we're experiencing an uptick of anti-Asian hate crimes, especially when it comes to our elders or it comes to folks. You know, I it's a difficult issue for sure, certainly as an Asian American living in an Asian American community. But it's something, something I always remind myself and my colleagues, even though oddly enough I am the youngest member, is I think back to in the body I serve, the historic body, the state legislature passed the Chinese Exclusion Act way back in the 1800s. Well, in the the later 1800s. Um, and there's this and I remind myself of this because Chinese folk, like myself, Chinese folks, Asian Americans have always been victims of the systemic racism that exists in this country, even to this day. And what we're seeing now is the latest manifestation of that. Because we literally had a president, sitting president say, oh, the Chinese virus, blame Chinese people. And, I think a lot of people kind of acted on that because they felt that discriminatory behavior was valid, was acceptable again. And unfortunately, that's the kind of damage we're going to have to rectify for maybe decades to come. But it's difficult because there's a lot of folks who are, I think, rightly afraid and rightly anxious but we also have to take it what our response is with nuance, and knowing that this is a large issue that stems from centuries of historic racism, and we must resist. And I talked to this about folks, but we have to resist this temptation for revenge or temptation for quick solutions, because these are long-standing issues that have been around for centuries, and unfortunately, they take a lot of work. It's going to be difficult work to undo them all, and we as Asian Americans are in the same unfortunate wave of anti-black hatred, anti-Semitism that all exists across the country, because this, like I said, we had a sitting president who allowed basically said all these things are okay and acceptable, and that permeated downward. So we have to really be looking at how we have collective liberation, collective solidarity with all our people, with all communities of color, with all communities who have been oppressed. And as someone who personally identifies with several different communities that are oppressed, so I'm LGBTQ, I'm Asian American. So there's a lot of ways we can do it, and being intersectional and being very deliberate and very community-based. So things I would always ask people to do is, one, obviously get educated and be aware of these things, and then support the local Asian American communities that are especially hurting, because what we want to do, right, is centered around folks who have been wronged, folks who have been harmed. And I'm really glad to be working, somewhat in tandem with organizers in Chinatowns, like in Oakland Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown, and really seeing and listening to them what they need. Because I think that's the first important step, is educate yourself, listen to what the community needs, and then act in solidarity and allyship. And then hopefully we'll be able to fix these historic injustices in less time or in quicker time than we'd hope. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that thoughtful response, Alex. And I know that as a young person and an Asian American from our community, it must be very meaningful to some of the folks that you're representing to have you in Sacramento to represent them. So thank you for doing that. Let's take a short break and come back in a minute or two and talk about what you've been up to in Sacramento, because for a new member or a relatively recently joining member, you've been pretty active, and I'd like to give people a chance to hear about some of the things you've been up to. So we'll be back in just a minute with Assembly Member Alex Lee.
Hi, I'm Sally Lieber, former state assemblywoman and former mayor of Mountain View. I want to invite you to get involved in politics here in our local community and volunteer. There's so many opportunities. It's a great time for young people, for seniors, for everyone who's interested in making a difference to come on out and get involved. You can find out more about the Santa Clara County Democratic Party by visiting sccdp.org or calling 408-445-9500. There are a lot of volunteer roles available. It's a great way to connect with old friends or meet new friends, and we need you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching Democratic Television. We're back for the second half of our interview with Assembly Member Alex Lee. Alex Lee represents the 25th Assembly District in Sacramento. Alex, thank you for the first half of the show. Great to be with you for this second segment. I wanted to ask you a bit about your initiatives in Sacramento. You have a number of very interesting bills that I think are bringing show that you're bringing a new perspective to Sacramento. One that caught my eye is your bill on social housing. Housing and homelessness have been big issues in our area in Santa Clara County and also throughout the state. What is social housing, and what made it a priority for you to bring that forward as a bill?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, social housing, this most succinct definition I've heard and I think of is it is housing that is publicly developed and maintained, not reliant on the for-profit market. And why this is so important is because housing affordability is the number one issue that is pressing my constituents right now. Besides from COVID. COVID is obviously the overarching disaster thing happening right now, but right under that is going to be housing affordability. It is way too expensive for folks to live in the communities that they have been building or been raised in. I personally am in the same boat. I am only able to live in San Jose because I live here at home with my family, where I also live in my high school bedroom. So, and that's something, and why I talk about it so publicly all the time is because I want to normalize that and destigmatize that, because that's the reality for a lot of young people and even older folks, where there's a lot of, in my district, there's a lot of folks who have 4 generations in one household, and perhaps that's not by choice, that's by economic necessity. Right now, housing insecurity is also the way that I truly believe everyone feels our inequality in our system, whether you have housing or you don't have housing, whether it's way too expensive for you, or you're getting it way too easily. If that's your case, then bless you, you're very lucky. That's the inequality that we're facing right now. And with the Social Housing Act, which is Assembly Bill 387, we're hoping to have a real transformative new tool to fill the need to build quality, affordable housing that is meant for everyone. Because the vision is that we should be able to publicly decide how to use our lands, how to use our resources to make it so that people of all incomes can live in any neighborhood. And that's what it really is. Right now, the bill is still in the works because I have a strong commitment of working with our housing justice folks, housing advocates, labor unions, and everyone who wants to be involved in this to really build a proposal from the ground up rather than kind of have a top-down approach, because I really think that's going to make the strongest approach to it. And hopefully, once we're done with this process, we really will have a publicly driven 3Ps approach, which is, the production of housing, the preservation of affordable housing, and the protection of working families. And that will be all done under the umbrella of a collective public approach.
In your work on this so far, Alex, where are you finding people as you first talk to them about this? Are you having to educate them about the whole? I mean, does it blow their mind? Because I think the focus has been on private development of housing. All of the proposals, even the ones that have been considered to be innovative, have really focused on removing obstacles and making the process of private developers to develop housing as a way of increasing supply. It's really been the focus. There's been a little bit of development of public land around the edges, but even then, it's been public agencies making their own decision to use public land in connection with privately funded development or occasionally nonprofit developers. Do people, panic when you start to tell them that the public would own housing and build this housing?
No panicking yet. For sure, there's a lot of education to be doing because the term social housing is not mainstream yet, though I think it is going to gain a lot of traction. We have a similar efforts happening in Hawaii and Maryland, so we're going to see who gets the finish line at first. But I think folks, once they're educated about the issue, or thankfully there's a lot of folks who also seem to know what social housing is, they're quite excited about it. I actually have a lot of colleagues who are excited about the concept of social housing and how it can be realized. The trick, of course, is the realization of it, putting it in practice, right? Because we cannot, and I would never shy away from this, but in this country, we do have a bad rap when it comes to public housing. There were deliberate policy choices made along the way that made them into the terrible places for people of color that happened, because frankly, we had very racist people and very racist policies that existed since the interwar era. But that's something we should not repeat, because there are great examples in Europe and in Asia that have social housing models that are older than even our own in this country, that have done it well because they have maintained this policy and they have maintained that commitment to housing people as a social good, and that's what we're hoping to do too.
Alex, what's one example of a difference between this conception of social housing and the public housing developments in the U.S. that you make reference to? What prevents things from devolving to that experience that you rightly identify as one that's unfortunate in the ways that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. My commitment is to do it as a mixed income neighborhoods. The historic problem in the United States is they have been, when they were built, they were objectively much nicer places than the slums that they had destroyed, right? I mean, they also destroyed a lot of people's lives in the process, but objectively, people like them. But the problem was they fell apart over time because of historic disinvestment for a lot of different reasons. And because they were also they're basically warehouses for the poor. They were income capped, they were income restricted. So once you made a little bit more money, and you rightfully should hopefully be growing in social mobility, you were kicked out and you weren't be able to either reinvest in your community, in your neighborhood. So my vision is that hopefully I want this to be a neighborhood for everyone. In Austria, they have this great saying where in the same apartment block, you can have politicians, rock stars, and people on welfare living in the same place. And they all have similar accommodations. But because people have different means, they're able to reinvest in their social housing differently. So hopefully, and this also happens in the current marketplace, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but hopefully over time, this cross-subsidization will be able to self-sustain the neighborhood, just as we see oftentimes. In the private market now, with housing development, we talk about what's a policy called inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing, which is essentially a market rate unit, say 100 units, and 15% of them have to be legally affordable to certain income brackets. And because of that, that's cross subsidization. That's meaning the folks who have more income are able to subsidize the folks who have lower incomes, right? And they live in the same building. That is a concept embraced by the marketplace. So why can't we also embrace the same concept of cross subsidization in the public sphere? And that's hopefully how we do it. So I think getting off the ground, we're going to get catalyst funding. There's a lot of different sources and means to do that. And then over time, with a big enough portfolio, these neighborhoods could be self-sustaining. Unlike in this country with our examples, they need to be constantly subsidized because there's no way they can cross-subsidize if everyone is in low income that does not meet the maintenance needs of the building or the neighborhood.
Well, I think that in recent years, especially with what happened with Trump and some of the kind of voters who supported him and the reasons that people seem to be understanding that he may have gained some support in quarters where frankly, we got comfortable considering them as being Democratic constituencies. There seems to be a growing understanding and recognition in the Democratic Party that we need to be able to show that government can solve problems, and including big problems. Housing and homelessness in California are big problems, and honestly, even our Democratic government hasn't been making progress on them. One of the things that we've seen that we know though is that it takes revenue to do big things. What are your ideas on the revenue side? Where are the opportunities there?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Bill. I'm actually working on either myself or jointly working on like 4 different tax proposals. The one I'm most excited and the one that I'm going to be carrying soon has not been introduced yet, but is going to be a California tax on extreme wealth. So if you've heard about Elizabeth Warren's 2 cents on multimillionaires, ours is very, very similar. In fact, we have some of the same economists working on a proposal. So we're very excited to be working in tandem, hopefully with Elizabeth Warren and a lot of great supporters, and a lot of great people in it. Ours is going to be a 1% tax on people with wealth assets, with wealth over 50 million. So if you are a 49 millionaire, you are okay. This will not affect you. But for folks that are making over 50 million and more, 1%. All we're asking for is 1 cent per dollar. And that could generate out of just the 0.07% of the wealthiest households in California. That's the top 1% of the top 1%, would generate us $22 billion. $22 billion. And that could go a long way to reinvest in our schools, in our housing, our healthcare, a huge way. And it's a modest proposal, I think, to acknowledge that California has really enabled a lot of people to prosper, because I think they were lucky and they were able to work hard at it, and that's fine. But they should also be able to reinvest in the communities that make it possible, the people that make it so that they can make their multi-millions. And I don't think it's something too difficult to ask for, because that $22 billion could produce the new workforce of tomorrow, a new generation of leadership, and perhaps even more multi-millionaires. But all we're asking for is a modest 1%, and that could be a real game changer in funding all the things that we care about.
Well, we look forward to seeing the details of that proposal, Alex. And I know that it addresses head on some of the dichotomies we see in our society, whereas California is a very wealthy state and generates a lot of wealth, and yet we have these disparities and we have these needs that are not currently being met. And of course, a lot of wealth generation is a lot of wealth is generated through activities that benefit from a lot of social goods, like the UC system schools we were talking about, and other services. So that'll be an interesting conversation. So thank you for bringing that forward. I want to ask you about being a new legislator and being a young legislator. How have you been received in your perception in Sacramento? And do you feel like you're, just for lack of a better word, are you getting the respect that you need to be able to do what you're doing?
That's a great question. I think I am getting the respect I should get from being one of the equals in government, right? I'm one of 120 legislators in the biggest democracy in our union. But I mean, there were always times where I think just because I'm in a room, I'm the youngest person, people do look down on my opinion sometimes. But it has always been my mission to do my homework, do the research, and really speak truth to power. Because I really want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting young people, because I think there are plenty of brilliant, talented young people. And you have to look no further than my district, right, where there are startups on the regular disrupting how we do things, and they're helmed by folks who are perhaps even younger than I So it's really important to me to be putting my best foot forward all the time. Although that sometimes is quite taxing, I think it's important to do so. But I also have a lot of great colleagues, I think, that believe in my vision and believe in me. And I'm really blessed to have those folks help me along in the process and figure things out too.
Alex Lee, if folks would like to reach you about something they heard about today, or maybe a question I didn't ask, what's the best way for them to reach you?
The best way for folks to reach me, they can visit my website. That's votealexlee.com, and they can contact us that way. It's the best way to do it. votealexlee.com.
Well, Alex Lee, I really appreciate your generosity and time today. Thank you for being our representative in Sacramento, and for representing your generation and all the communities that you represent in Santa Clara County. I appreciate all the work you do, and we know that it's it's intense probably every day. So thank you for what you do.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's great to be on the show. Thank you.
Thank you for watching DTV. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website at www.sccdp.org. Help us to make a difference. We'll see you on the campaign trail.